Hello, and welcome to this Forum on Sustainability organized by Cell Press. In the next hour or so, we will discuss the challenges and opportunities for managing fire risk in a warming world. My name is Abby Kelly, and I'm an editor at One Earth, Cell Press's flagship sustainability and environmental science journal. Behind the scenes today, helping moderate the discussion, are my fellow editors Ninad Bandra and Camilla Mauricio. Ninad is a senior editor for sustainability research and initiatives at Cell Press, and Camilla is an editor at iScience. Just quickly in terms of format, following this brief introduction, I will invite our keynote speaker, Branda Noel, to present her thoughts, and then invite our panelists, Kevin Bladen, Max Moritz, and Colleen Reed, to provide introductions to their research areas. Jessica Holofsky unfortunately cannot make it today. Following that, we will have a moderated panel discussion on the topic of navigating the Pyrocene. Before we begin, I wanted to highlight Cell Press's growing portfolio of sustainability journals. 2024 marks the 50th anniversary of Cell Press, and as we celebrate this milestone, we continue to focus on the real-world impact of the science we publish and advocate for the scientists who are dedicated to discovering better outcomes. Besides the core sustainability journals at One Earth and Cell Report Sustainability, several other journals frequently publish sustainability relevant content, including Joule, Trends in Ecology and Evolution, and iScience. One Earth and Cell Report Sustainability recently collaborated to feature a range of fire-related content in our respective June issues, which we encourage you to peruse. They are linked in the resources tab to the left. One of the things that makes sustainability research so challenging and also so exciting is how interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary it can be. Using fire as the timely example, addressing fire risk requires not only understanding how changing climate and human land use patterns have altered and will alter fire regimes, but also factors that contribute to community vulnerability and capacity to respond, and a cascade of other interactions. This is why we began the Cell Press Forums on Sustainability. We hope to bring together scholars with complementary expertise and spark conversations on the complex challenges of navigating a more sustainable path forward. The Cell Press Sustainability Hub, which is linked in the resources tab of this webinar, provides a home for past forums on plastic and the global stocktake, and will soon feature a recording of this one. Before I hand the virtual mic over to Branda to open the forum, I'd like to highlight some logistical details for our audience. You should see a resources tab, which is where some of the recent Cell Press fire-related content is provided. On the right is our Q&A chat. We encourage you to ask questions for the speakers or upvote questions from others that you are also curious about. Our behind-the-scenes team will be adding links to the references that come up in conversation to the top of the Q&A as well. Finally, we have a quick survey that we'd very much appreciate you filling out after the forum, which should pop up on your screens towards the end. Finally, without further ado, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Branda Noel. Branda is a professor at the School of Public and International Affairs at North Carolina State University. Her interdisciplinary research integrates community and organizational psychology with public management, and she currently co-leads the Fire Chasers Project. In collaboration with the U.S. Forest Service, the Fire Chasers research team works to advance interagency coordination and communication and improve communities' capacity for resilience in the face of wildfire disasters. Over to you, Branda.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Abby. I appreciate it, and great to have the opportunity to be here and with this amazing panel. So today I wanted to talk about coupled natural, human, and institutional systems as sort of a framework for kind of thinking about this concept of wildfire resilience. So I am trying to advance slides, and I think it's not allowing me to advance here. Sarah, I might need some, or Abby, I might need some help with the advancing slides. For some reason, the advance isn't working.
Are you the only one clicking right now?
Oh, there we go. So
Okay.
we just. Okay. Let me see if I can do. I think somebody else was able to do that. So I might need to just get some assist on advancing where we're at.
Okay. Are you trying to be on slide 3 right now?
Just slide 2. Just slide 2.
Okay.
And I'll just say next slide if that works.
Yep. Sounds good.
Okay. All right. So many people, I'm sure, have heard of coupled natural and human systems. This was a concept that I think came, I remember it coming on stage sort of late 90s, early 2000s. There was a lot of focus and excitement about sort of how we think about coupling between human systems and natural systems. We're flashing here a little bit, but we'll just go ahead and keep rolling through. So the concept here is that, we need to understand these sort of reciprocal influences between system dynamics. And so what I'd like to do is sort of add a little bit of an adaptation to that and introduce the concept of institutional systems and system behavior. Next slide. And I think, particularly in terms of this very, impressive panel that we have today, it's a nice way to sort of take all of the different work that's happening around wildfire and thinking about resilience in wildfire and sort of situate it in a more holistic perspective. And so that's why I like it. And thinking about resilience as really a challenge of understanding coupling. Oftentimes we're thinking about things being vulnerable or at risk. It's because there's coupling that is not being managed in some way that is leading to outcomes that are not desirable. So we're talking about our natural systems. This is us thinking about the atmospheric processes, the ecological regimes, the topography, weather, climate, the biogeochemical and hydrological cycling, all of those components. When we talk about human systems and human behavior, generally we're thinking about things in terms of societal norms and cultures, attitudes of collectives, attitudes, values, and beliefs of individuals, social geography and demographics, those sorts of things. We often also think about politics, economies, and infrastructure, sort of that bridge between the human systems and the institutional systems. And then we're thinking about institutional systems, which we don't talk about quite as much. We're thinking about the capacity of the institutions that have formal and also informal responsibilities to respond and address some of the challenges that we see going. So we're thinking about institutional mandates and logics, policy and legal frameworks, and governance systems. Next slide, please. And so we can think about kind of the narratives about escalating wildfire risk within the context of this sort of framework. So we hear a lot about how sort of historical patterns of land use and fire suppression strategies and sort of changes in human populations and expansion of communities into the wildland-urban interface are leading to, and also contributions into climate change through the carbon cycling is leading to ecological changes, climate changes, and that those are affecting extreme fire behavior, which is then increasing risk that then has responses that we need to think about in terms of community risk mitigation, household risk mitigation, emergency response, or insurance systems, all of those. So we can kind of think about how all of these pieces come together into this framework. Next slide, please. And so we can also think about a lot of the questions that I think from the scholarly community, we focus a lot of attention on in terms of where sort of people and different scholars sort of situate themselves in terms of the kinds of influences. So there's a lot of work happening right now on how human behavior is influencing natural systems. So to what extent, for example, are climate effects from human-caused greenhouse gas emissions contributing to more extreme fire behavior might be an example of that. We can think about the inverse, how are changes in the natural system affecting humans? So in what ways and where are the wildfire risk to human settlements increasing? So we're seeing a lot of work in analytics and whatnot focusing on that. We're seeing a lot of work from the institutional to human behavior. So a lot of focus we see, especially coming from the agencies, is thinking about how do we get people to think and act differently in terms of of human behavior that we feel like is contributing to some of the challenges. And then also a lot of focus on how different land management and suppression actions and policies are influencing fire behavior. So how is it that the things that we're doing from either a policy standpoint or a management standpoint is making changes on the landscape? So that that arrow up there linking institutional system behavior to natural system behavior. Next slide, please. And so those are all really important pieces of the puzzle. This is a piece of the puzzle on this slide that I think is somewhat underrepresented in terms of how much work is happening here. It's also my favorite piece of the puzzle. I'm an organizational psychologist by training. And so I think a lot about institutional design and adaptation in the context of complexity, specific and focus a lot of my research on disasters in the wildfire context and thinking about the natural system, how things are changing in the natural system, and what that means in terms of the changing task demands on our institutions that, again, have responsibilities to protect communities, for example, to manage lands, to sort of respond to these challenges. Next slide. And so when we think about that linkage between the natural system and institutional systems, those are mediated through what I call the task environment. And so the task environment is basically what is it we're asking our institutions. And by institutions, I mean everything from the laws that are governing us and the policy frameworks that they're using to the actual organizations and agencies that have for a long time are sort of positioned and have formal responsibility and authority to be able to respond to challenges related to wildfire. And so, this leads to questions about how changes in this biophysical environment are creating new demands for institutional adaptation. So what is it that we need our institutions to be able to do differently if we are dealing with a different sort of biophysical environment? And then how, when, and under what conditions are institutions able to effectively adapt to these new task environments? Next slide. And so why might we care about that? So one of the questions that has come out of my field work over the last almost 20 years with wildfire is trying to understand how these institutional demands are changing. And so, why do we care about, again, changing task environment? Well, organization design has to align with the demands of the task environment in order to be effective. So we need our institutions to sort of be aligned with what it is that we're asking them to do. And that's a big challenge, particularly in the context of a lot of institutional complexity, because, I sort of tongue-in-cheek call it the Noel principle of institutional change within mega bureaucracies. But in my experience, it usually takes about 15 to 20 years to fundamentally shift an institutional logic of a mega bureaucracy. So by mega bureaucracy, I'm talking about very differentiated bureaucracies that tier from federal levels down to sort of local level units. So you can think about most of our sort of federal agencies as examples of mega bureaucracies. And so if what we want those institutions to be doing is fundamentally different than what they've been doing in the past, that doesn't pivot on a dime. It's going to take a little bit of an on-ramp to sort of adjust all of those systems because they're highly complex and interconnected as well. And so changes in one aspect tend to have a lot of cascading downstream changes that also require some sort of reverse engineering. And so it really means that if there's sort of these needs for institutional adaptation, the sooner we can recognize those and start to kind of get them adjusted, the better positioned we're going to be moving into the future. And so I want to present as just sort of an illustration of this, some work that I've done with some current and former students, Kate Jones and Shannon McGovern, on looking longitudinally over the last 20 years of complex wildfire events, so type 1 and type 2 incidents in terms of their changes in institutional complexity. Next slide. So one of the things that we looked at was changes in the governance complexity of wildfire. So I think this is a picture of all of the different jurisdictional delineations that exist in the United States in terms of land tenure and ownership. So who owns what land? And so each color doesn't correspond to any specific thing, but a change in color means a different change in land tenure ownership. And so you can see that sort of this devolution of authority and responsibility over land tenures is baked into our design in the United States. And so when we think about fires growing larger, which is part of one of the challenges we're seeing, one of the questions is, are they moving across more jurisdictional boundaries? Because if that's the case, it's not just the fire that we have to deal with. Now it's an increasingly complex governance system that has to come online in order to collectively what we call co-manage those fires, because the authorities are different when the fire moves across a different jurisdictional boundary. And so that creates some institutional complexity. Next slide. So if we look at the last 20 years in terms of the jurisdictional complexity of type 1 and type 2 incidents, so these are some of the most complex incidents in the nation. So these are ones required either a type 1 or type 2 incident management team. We see in general there has been a slight increasing trend in the complexity of these fires, and that is most of that is happening. If you look at the darker brown colors are where the trend is stronger by region or GAC. So we can see, for example, in Northern California, they have seen the greatest increase in the jurisdictional complexity of their fires. Next. So another aspect of governance complexity has to take into account resource constraint. So there are a limited number of type 1 and type 2 fire engines, heli-tac, hotshot crews in the nation. And so when we have a lot of fire activity going on that requires those sorts of elite assets, then they start to get in resource competition with each other. And that is designated by what we call the PL level, or preparedness level. So at PL levels 4 and 5, it means that most of the nation's resources around wildfire have already been committed or on mandatory leave, rest, following response to a wildfire. And so what that means from a governance standpoint is that when we increase the governance complexity of a wildfire and the number of actors that have to come to agreement about how we manage those fires, we also may be doing it under conditions of increasing resource constraint, which means that when we have less resources to throw at a wildfire, it means that we are not able to address a much more complex set of objectives. So more governance complexity, more jurisdictions affected means that there's probably more objectives that they're going to want to try and accomplish on that fire. More resource constraints means there's less resources to be able to accomplish those objectives. And so you can see the areas that are seeing the more jurisdictional complexity are also starting to see more days where they're trying to manage that complexity under conditions of resource constraint. Next slide. And then the last one I wanted to just kind of give a nod to here is the emergency management complexity. So this is based on trends in the numbers of structures threatened, damaged, and destroyed during type 1 and type 2 incidents. This has several aspects of institutional complexity, but one of the ones that's most important is that when we are seeing structures threatened, damaged, and destroyed, it means that there is generally a whole suite of other function areas that have to become online in responding to that wildfire. So now we've probably got road closures. We've probably got evacuations. We probably have sheltering. We probably have mass care for folks who have been evacuated. All of those systems are managed by other institutions. They are not the same systems as the ones that are managing the wildfire. And so when those things are co-occurring, it creates a much more complex institutional environment. And as you can see, this is some of the areas where we're seeing some of the greatest increases in trends in terms of complexity. Next slide. So what does this all mean? What's the kind of upshot of all of this? Is that, moving forward, based on the trends that we've seen in the last 20 years and what, we've seen in the climate models and other modeling that's occurred, is that we are going to see a growing need for fireshed scale governance capacity before the fire across land jurisdictions. Fire does not care where we draw jurisdictional boundary lines. It burns wherever it's going to burn, which means that the ability to be able to coordinate and govern a wildfire across tribal, federal, state, and private boundaries is going to become increasingly paramount to our success in managing wildfire. And so these are not systems that you want to set up during the middle of a firefight. Ideally, you want to have these relationships and these sort of governance capacity built well ahead of when these fires are happening. So being able to start governing at fireshed levels as opposed to jurisdictional levels is something that we are probably going to need to put a lot more attention to. And then also in similarity to that is this heightened demand for coordination across both the fire management systems, which again are driven by land tenures, and the emergency management systems, which work on different systems. And oftentimes we'll have completely separate incident command posts and governance structures. And so there's going to be an increasing need for our emergency management systems and our fire management systems to be in tight coordination with each other. And so with that, I think, go ahead, last slide. Just thank you. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion of the panel today.
Thank you, Branda. I just want to acknowledge that it sounds like we did have a bit of technical difficulties at the beginning. It turns out the audience needs to turn on your sound in order to hear us. So I apologize for that. If that happened to you and impacted you in the audience, you will be able to hear the full sound in the recording. Branda, that was such an excellent introduction. Thank you so much. We're looking forward to discussing some of those topics in greater detail soon. I will now introduce our additional speakers and invite them to share a bit more about their own research backgrounds. Starting off with Kevin Bladen. Kevin is a professor and department head in the Department of Forest, Ecosystems, and Society, College of Forestry at Oregon State University. So can you tell us about what you work on, Kevin?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for inviting me to be here today. I also look forward to the discussion. The cartoon you're seeing on the screen right now, I think is a really good depiction of the breadth of the type of research that I undertake with folks in my research group and collaborators. And so I'll walk you through this. You know, if we work from left to right, you know, our group is really interested in trying to understand how wildfire might impact a range of hydrological processes or biochemical processes that influence the state of streams. So looking at things like sediment concentrations, turbidity, key nutrients like phosphorus and nitrogen, as well as carbon and heavy metals. And then we're also interested in thinking about, okay, if we see changes in the state of our streams, do we see impacts? And those impacts are things like aquatic ecosystem health. So are we seeing changes in primary productivity, invertebrates, amphibians, fish? And then there's the socioeconomic side of things that we're interested in. Do we see changes in recreational behaviors? Do we see impacts downstream to our communities and drinking water treatment? And then overall, we're interested in producing science that's actionable. So with that understanding, providing knowledge that enables folks to make management and policy decisions to mitigate some of the risks of the changes in water quantity and quality that can occur. The challenge with this type of work that we undertake, though, is that the effects of fire on both quantity and quality of water are both temporally and spatially discontinuous and really dependent on the context in which the fire occurs. And so these two figures really illustrate that nicely. The one on the left, on the x-axis is time zero being when the fire occurs, and then the y-axis is just any number of metric we might be interested in. It could be phosphorus or carbon or fish. And what we often see and expect is this black dashed line where we would expect to see an increase in some parameter after fire and then some decrease back to some pre-fire level over time. But that's not always the case. We actually see any number of these other pathways for changes in parameters. And sometimes we see declines of really substantial nature and not what we would expect. And then the figure on the right shows the spatial discontinuity. This is just an example from the Holiday Farm Fire in the McKenzie Basin in Oregon, where we've collected about 130 samples over since the fire at multiple times during the year, both above the fire perimeter, within the fire, and then downstream of the fire. The colors of the little dots are where we've taken the samples, and they indicate different dissolved organic carbon concentrations in this example. And then we're using that to develop predictive models. And really what this illustrates is a lot of spatial variability in that carbon concentration, which may not necessarily be driven by the fire. And that's part of why we want to develop these predictive models to try to gain a better understanding of what's driving changes in water quality. And then the last piece I'll leave you with here, one last perspective that we can all appreciate, is the economic side of things. The figure on the top left are the suppression costs annually in the US, and you've seen that grow over the last number of years to where we're spending approximately $2.5 to $4 billion a year just to put fires out. But natural resource economists who've assessed the true cost of fires associated with the long-term impacts on loss of recreational values or timber values, or the impacts on water supply, have put that number at anywhere between 2 to 30 to even a more recent report here, 35 to 150 times greater than those costs alone. And these are real costs that get passed on to communities and taxpayers long after the fire. And so hopefully I've just given you some things here, just planted a seed of some things we could talk about. I really look forward to our discussion today.
Thank you. That was excellent. Moving right along, Colleen Reed is an associate professor of geography at the University of Colorado Boulder. And can you tell us about your research and work, Colleen?
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm very excited about this discussion as well. I come at it from a different perspective. I am a health geographer. I'm trained in environmental epidemiology, and my research focuses on the health impacts of wildfire smoke. And so a lot of my work to date has been documenting health impacts of exposure to wildfire smoke. So my group will model wildfire smoke across space and time and link that with health data to try and see whether or not there is a health impact. And when I first started this work, it was a lot of people were asking me, would wildfire smoke even harm health? It is sort of a natural air pollutant rather than sort of industrial or combustion from fossil fuels associated with air pollution. And so when I first looked into that, there was some evidence, but I think that my work and the work of many, many others and a growing number of colleagues has shown that there are effects of wildfire smoke exposure on respiratory health, particularly very consistently for exacerbations of asthma, but also for exacerbations of things like chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. We also have growing evidence that wildfire smoke is associated with increased risk of respiratory infections, including COVID and influenza. And then additionally, we're seeing that there are likely impacts on birth outcomes, such as preterm birth or lower birth weights, and additionally, increases in all-cause mortality. But there's also a lot of area to explore this further. We have a lot of inconsistency in findings in terms of the impacts of wildfire smoke on cardiovascular health outcomes. And then additionally, people are interested in looking at a variety of other health outcomes that haven't really been examined yet. So there's a lot of work to be done there. In addition to that, my research group, we're always sort of interested in the fact that any environmental exposure that affects health is not it's not the same for everybody. And so we want to try to identify which populations are more affected by wildfire smoke than others. And the work that I've done and others have done on this is actually quite inconsistent, except for the fact that people with pre-existing respiratory disease are more affected. And so we need a lot more research into this to better understand if specific population subgroups are more affected than others. And it's complicated because there's so many different things that affect our exposure to wildfire smoke. Do we use air cleaners inside? Do we live and work in environments with air conditioning and tight building envelopes or not? And so, and then also, do we take other precautions? And so increasingly, I am moving towards those types of research in terms of what we can do from a public health perspective to protect people from wildfire smoke, because wildfire smoke is a growing source of the air pollution that we breathe. We're doing a really good job of regulating air pollution from vehicles and air pollution from industrial sources. And so more and more, of the air pollution that we're breathing, particularly in Western North America, but in other places too, is from wildfire smoke. And so, but we can't regulate it the way we've done other sources of air pollution, right? We can't put a scrubber on that smokestack of the wildfire smoke plume. And so we, which is what we've done for, say, emissions from industrial sources. And so I'm doing research to try and think about, from a public health perspective, how can we create clean air spaces? So I'm looking at schools and homes to better understand what types of buildings are more infiltrated by smoke during smoke events, and therefore what we can do to intervene on the ones that are leakier. And so that could do to things like weatherization or HVAC systems or air cleaners. And then additionally, how we can get people to actually invest in these public and private spaces that can keep us safe from smoke. And then another area of health impacts of wildfire smoke that we need to focus on is some of the inconsistency across studies could be due to the fact that we are mostly focused on in the health world on the particles that are emitted from the wildfire smoke, and that the chemistry of these particles could differ by what is being burned. And we're having more and more fires that are burning more structures, and that can change the chemistry of the particles. It also can change the gases that are in the smoke plumes. And then, of course, there's differences in the aging of those smoke plumes in terms of what we're breathing in. And so we need to look at those more to better understand the health impacts, but also then what we can do to protect people. And then additionally, I'm always asked about, we know a lot about the short-term health impacts of wildfire smoke, but a lot of people are interested in, well, what are the long-term impacts? And are there certain times in a lifespan where these exposures matter? And then particularly because in a lot of places in the Western US, we're having every season and the seasons are getting longer. So we're kind of having these very high exposures to wildfire smoke that are very intermittent, but that are repeated and not one-time events. And we need to better understand that. And so that's a lot that I hope we can discuss further in the call.
Thank you. So interesting. All right, and our last speaker is Max Moritz. He is a wildfire specialist with the University of California Cooperative Extension and an adjunct professor at the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management. And Max, can you share about your work for a bit?
And land here at the end, looking at some of the problems with the wildland-urban interface, the WUI. The top here picture is from the campfire paradise a few years ago, and the bottom is Lahaina, to identify some gaps in how to solve this particular problem, because I think if it weren't for the risks to lives and homes, we would think about wildfire quite differently. So, okay, in the translation, we've lost a few animations. Starting off early in my career, we were looking at new data sets, new global patterns of fire from satellites. This was about 15 years ago, and it allowed us to finally start asking questions about why we were seeing different kinds and frequencies of fire in different parts of the world. And we were able to actually quantify some of those relationships between fire activity and environmental variables and project them into the future. And that's what we're looking at here. There's some maps of some climate change driven fire futures. I don't want to focus on this particular scenario because there's been many of them since then, but it allowed us to start thinking about why and how to model this. And so, for example, it gave us some ideas which coalesced into a kind of a subfield of pyrogeography. On the left here, you see a figure showing the relationship between fire activity or fire frequencies on the y-axis, and how that's driven by sort of a primary gradient in productivity and net primary productivity. That's what we found across most of the world. And then in very low productivity environments on the left-hand side, there's a certain set of environmental variables that influence fire frequencies. And in the higher productivity environments, there's another set. And how this kind of came together on the right-hand figure here is this fire regime triangle. Basically, how resources to burn and productivity, fuel accumulation rates, how that interplays with atmospheric conditions governing the fire season, right? Governing flammability of whatever is there, and ignitions, how all three of those come together in our thinking and in our models to actually predict fire activity was a big, exciting advance for a lot of us. As you move to finer spatial scales, one of the things that we've learned is you can't leave humans out of the equations. So the right-hand side here are some future fire projections for California fire probabilities in the near term. This is used for actually targeting fuel treatments and so wide programs. On the left, though, is one of the functional response curves that came out of this modeling at finer spatial scales. And this shows the relationship of fire activity to population or housing densities. You have this hump-shaped curve that has been found in other studies, and it's actually a pretty important relationship because it tells us that where and how we build our communities determines not only our exposure to fire, right, where we're settling on these landscapes and how often people actually are exposed to fire, but it feeds back to affect the baseline fire probabilities themselves. So actually land use and urban planning is a way that we can affect not only our exposure and our risk, but also future fire probabilities themselves. And so this highlights some important policy levers we have. Oh boy, the animations have all gone away. So what you're seeing is sort of odd. One of the cases I wanted to make was that there are different scales of planning decisions that range from the individual parcel on up to the neighborhood scale. So we have building codes right now, which are enforced in California, for example, but not many other places. I think we're kind of unique in that sense. But we don't have any guidance, any standards beyond the scale of building codes at an individual structure, right? We don't have any guidance or standards that help us decide how to lay out a community to make it more sustainable or survivable, how to buffer that community from wildfire with agriculture or fields or higher foliar moisture land cover types, or even where to site communities in the first place, to use fire hazard maps to guide some of those decisions. Even though we have building codes at the scale of an individual structure, an individual parcel, we still need some sort of design standards for where and how we build at broader scales. And with that, I'll stop and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. So we're so excited to have all of you here today for this discussion. We're now going to transition to the more conversational part of the forum. And just a reminder to the audience, you are welcome to submit questions to the Q&A box on the right of your screen, and we'll be moderating the questions for our speakers. I've got a couple of questions to start us off, and certainly several that have been generated by the presentation so far. So thank you all. So I'd like to start us off with a question about time. In the adjacent field of climate adaptation, timescales of relevance come up a lot in transdisciplinary collaboration. For example, a lot of climate research looks at changing risks to 2050 and 2100, whereas local governments are often more concerned with adaptation actions they can take in the coming 1 to 10 years. So I'm wondering what timescales you work with in your research and how those timescales shape your collaborations. Max, I know you were just talking, but I think I'm going to throw this one to you to start us off, because I think you probably work with several different timescales.
Yeah, and that is a huge challenge, actually, because many of the, we can produce projections at the scale of this coming season, or the scale of 20 or 30 years from now. But the decisions that might need to be made aren't necessarily matching with those scales, right? One of the challenges, I think, with natural hazards like wildfire is that short-term decisions to minimize impacts, let's say, to a given wildfire, may or may not build resilience in the long term, right? There's actually something called the safe landscape paradox in urban planning, where you can build higher levees, or in the context of fire, you could have more fuel breaks that might make a community feel safer or be safer in the short term, but it might lead to longer term decisions to increase development in those same locations, which would increase risk, right, over the longer term. So you can have actually trade-offs in some of these decision-making processes that I think we're not really focusing on. We're usually focusing on the short term instead of the longer term adaptation and transformational resilience, or things like those concepts over the longer term.
Branda, I thought your introduction had a very interesting note about sort of the 10 to 15 year lag time for, I think you said, mega bureaucracies to change. I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on that sort of time limitation and how that might contribute to some of these challenges, perhaps.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really great question. I think, Max's point, I think is a very good one around sort of what's the near-term gains and long-term effects. And I think part of it is a technical challenge, and I think this links to mega bureaucracies a bit as well. Like when we think about changing how we do things, or the decisions that we use to support how we do things, there's so much to that. So even just like our decision support tools and the models that we use. So for example, the carbon cycling models that tend to be used for our climate change risk assessment stuff, like those were not designed to inform what's happening in the short term kinds of things. And similarly, the models that we've built and that inform policy in the near term don't really work well on long term. And so just really being able to get our arms around that. But I do think that even the things that we use as data to inform things are not necessarily data if you change scale. They're not relevant. They're not as useful. And so, I mean, you think about our suppression, which is kind of the bad guy of the story now, right? The historical fire suppression regimes, that the 10 o'clock, the 10 a.m. fire, that's now become the bad guy. That was the good guy back. Like that was how we were mitigating risk back when that came about. That was how we were protecting communities and whatnot. So I think that is sort of recognizing that these things have, that there's complexity in their interaction effects, both across systems as well as across time, is really important. That doesn't give us a lot of solution sets for that, but recognizing just that there's path dependency in how we do things. I think like Colleen's work is really important in that, like, for example, our fire systems and our public health systems are not very well coupled. And the public health systems are not very well coupled with the smoke regulation systems. So like we have a public health system that's very decentralized. It operates at a county level. We have an air quality regulation system that is highly centralized and operates at a federal level. And then we've got a fire management, which all of our prescribed fire systems are also tied into, which operate at very different scales. And so, we've just dropped the PM 2.5. So we've basically, some states are going to be trying to figure out ways to lower, air quality challenges in those, in terms of not having exceedances around problematic air quality, which may cause them to crank down on how much prescribed burning we have, which may cause them to lead to overgrowth of some forests to areas, which may increase fire risk, which may increase PM 2.5. So, I mean, the level of sort of coupling that I think we're dealing with right now is fairly intense. And so I think, and then just recognizing that these institutions, to get behind a new world order on that, are going to need a runway, just really sort of, I think, lays out the challenge for us. Like, we need to start to sort of get more holistic understanding about some of what strategic looks like in a near term and a long term, and to start sort of steering these agencies in those directions.
Super interesting. Very big picture needs there. Colleen or Kevin, do you have anything to add to that? All right, I really like the idea of fire sheds. I actually hadn't heard that term before. Sort of jumping off of what you were just talking about, air quality and how that maybe plays into a much larger geographic scale. Certainly, like last summer, the Canadian wildfires, where we saw smoke all the way down the East Coast. I'm not sure if you consider that one fire shed, but it was quite impactful. Is the fire shed term useful for framing how you think about air quality impacts, Colleen, and how do you sort of conceptualize that?
I mean, I think you're thinking of more of maybe a smoke shed, because you can have a fire. I think the fire shed is much more of a sort of an ecological term, is my understanding, but tell me where I'm wrong, because I'm much more on the smoke side of things. And the smoke, you know, there are topography aspects of smoke, and there's large scale movement of air across the world, parts of smoke, and there's lots of different spatial scales and temporal scales that go into that work as well. But I think that we would be focusing on a different geography than necessary. Like the fire shed could play out, but the smoke can go much, much beyond a given fire shed, depending on a lot of aspects of the fire. So the injection height of the plume, and sort of what are the other meteorological conditions that are affecting the transport of the smoke. So that's that's a little bit. It's another one of these complex spatio-temporal things and these different fields of fire research.
Thank you. Sort of thinking again about the complex impacts here, the risks of compound events such as combined heat waves and drought have gained a lot of attention in recent years. So what are some of the most worrisome compounding risks in terms of fire? Kevin, I know that you're working with watersheds, so perhaps you could start the conversation off there.
Sure. From a water perspective, I think our biggest concern is sort of the timing of wildfires and then large precipitation or flood events. A great example of this, I think, people may be familiar with, was the Thomas Fire, which happened in December in Ventura and Santa Barbara counties, and that coincided with a large precipitation event that led to substantial mass movements and the whole hillsides coming down, and that introduction of all of that, the sediment and a lot of the materials that come along with that into our water and then into our ocean systems, even with nutrients and metals that persist. I think just sort of that combination of those events we're always thinking about. The other one that we think a lot about from a hydrologic perspective is reburns. We're seeing a lot of locations that have once burned and they'll burn again, and I think we're starting to see some of that reburn leading to a real magnification of some of the water quality impacts that lead to some really substantial challenges for creating safe drinking water that persist for decades, and those costs get passed on to our communities just to ensure that we have water to drink.
Sorry. Thank you. That's super interesting. Anyone else to add comments about compounding risks of fires?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned heat, but I think that from a public health perspective, the we often get heat and wildfire smoke at the same time, and the public health messaging is completely contradictory for each one, right? So, for example, if you have bad air quality outside, you want to close your windows and shut your house as tight as possible. And when there's heat, you want to create airflow and to cool off a space. And obviously, there are some individuals who might not, who, you know, if you have air conditioning in your home, you might think, oh, that's not an issue. But we have a lot of individuals who live in places that didn't need air conditioning before, but kind of are needing it now and don't have air conditioning. And then additionally, even if someone has air conditioning, we know that the electric bill of turning it on is a reason why people don't turn on their air conditioning. And so as much as air conditioning can solve both of those exposures in indoor environments, we have a lot of times where, you know, people don't know what to do. You can either bring in a lot of air to cool off your home with fans and get a lot of smoke inside, or you can keep the smoke out, and then the indoor environment can get to levels where people can die. So there are these trade-offs when we think about heat waves and smoke events that happen at the same time. And then of course there would be the additional compounding event is if the heat were such that it caused either a rolling blackout or a blackout, and then people don't have the air conditioning as a way to protect themselves in indoor environments.
I'll add a thought. Often we think of compound drought and fire interactions, and there's an obvious intuitive link between drought and then the potential for increased fire risk. But going in the other direction, drought following fire is actually a big problem in terms of natural regeneration. Even if a fire is relatively normal characteristic in terms of its historical range of variation, if you have a drought following a fire in a forest or a shrubland, you can end up with the loss of a lot of native regeneration and the risk of type conversion from one vegetation or habitat type to another, which may or may not be a good thing, especially with a lot of invasive species on our landscapes.
I'll just add, that's a really great point, Max, because that is from a water perspective as well. We think a lot about that one because if you have that delayed recovery, that then confers potential for water to flow over land and create more erosive events. And so really getting reestablishment of vegetation as quickly as possible can really decrease some of the impacts that we're concerned about.
Thank you. That's a very interesting conversation. Now throwing an audience question at you from Chao Wu. Large fire size or high severity fires, which ones should we care more about? And I think that's a very interesting question. I'm guessing Max might be the person to answer this question first, but anyone can jump in.
Sure. Well, I think it depends on your perspective. If you're worried about smoke, right, they're both pretty terrible. I would imagine there can be very large wildfires within which the fire severity patterns are actually not all that worrisome, right? It depends on which ecosystem that we're talking about, because some ecosystems are naturally adapted to say frequent low severity fire, and others are more adapted to infrequent high severity fire. It runs the full range. So I don't necessarily think that many people managing and studying fires are always against big fires. You even hear some land management folks looking at big fires and saying, "Hey, we got a lot of acres treated there, right? As long as the severities we're not terrible." Again, that's not looking at the aquatic, hydrological side of things, and it's not looking at the smoke perspective. But I think that's what a lot of people in land and fire management and fire ecology from the terrestrial vegetation side often think.
I think you really emphasize the sort of the perspective matters for that question. So since we have such excellent range of perspectives here, Kevin, what about from the sort of hydrological perspective, size or severity?
Yeah, size or severity, I guess I think it depends on location, proximity to water. You know, is that fire burning into riparian areas close to streams, or do those remain intact? I think severity comes along with the increased potential for development of water repellency, where water can't enter into the soil, and there's greater opportunity for overland flow and erosion. And so I always would prefer a lower severity fire, you know, from a water perspective. But again, it's context dependent, and really, you know, where that fire is located relative to waterways.
Anything to add, Brenda or Colleen? Okay, we have another sort of more social question, I think, that was briefly in the chat, thinking about how increasing wildfire frequency might be causing migration. I assume the question was asking about human migration and changing sort of land use patterns, but also where people live. Are we starting to see people choose to live in different places now that fires are becoming more frequent? And sort of a follow-up portion of that is vulnerable communities. Are there vulnerable communities who are able to move or less able to move? Brenda, I'm going to throw that one to you first.
I'll take a swing at it. That may be one that Colleen, I think, might be able to run with a bit better. I think that we do buffer in general people from the effects of disasters fairly significantly. We buffer some people a lot better than others. If you're wealthier, if you can afford better insurance, those sorts of things. So we see a lot of rebuilding in very vulnerable places. Because people have insurance that, I remember being out on a fire, and I had a fire management officer point to a house that had burned down 3 times in the last, I think, 15 years. And they just kept rebuilding it. And it was paid for by insurance the entire time. So, I think there's that effect of that kind of buffering people from things. But that tends to, I think, be not equally distributed across the population in terms of, it tends to be a bit different depending on where you're at in the wealth perspective on that. So I think thinking about, as I think Colleen, I'll hand it over here because I think those, the notions of all of these impacts become much more significant. Access to clean water, access to clean air, able to get yourself evacuated if you're in danger, able to rebuild if you're burnt down. All of those things have significant environmental justice implications to them. So,
yeah. So this is not my work, but work of others that I know of. And then I know anecdotally from a fire here in Colorado. There's a concept of climate gentrification that's happening, whereby a place experiences a disaster, whether that's fire or flooding or other things, and homes are destroyed, and people who have good insurance plans rebuild, and people who are underinsured or not insured because they are renters or others have to go elsewhere. And then wealthy individuals come in and buy those properties at low value and then build up, right? So there are these things that are happening in some places where it's not causing people to abandon an area that is at high risk. It is actually making things sort of, you could say that the, individuals who are maybe more vulnerable are leaving that area, but I don't think that they're going to necessarily better environments or necessarily getting away from these hazards. It's just that I think that at least I've seen anecdotally, and I've read some papers that have documented this in a few different places, that that we don't have that happening. We're having people rebuild in places that we know are at high risk. And then I'd say additionally, though, related to what Brenda said about insurance, I know that some insurance companies are no longer willing to start new policies in certain places. And so only the very wealthy who maybe are willing to take on that risk without the insurance might move into those places. So there's a lot of different things going on. But I know that it's premiums are going up or just not even possible to get insurance in some places that are at fire risk.
Oops. Sorry, it took me a little while to unmute myself there. Really interesting. Thank you. Only a couple more questions I think we have time for. One that I think is rather interesting. Fire is becoming such a charismatic, for lack of a better word, subject in the mass media. Are there ways that you see fire risk being sensationalized that impact either positively or negatively mitigation and adaptation work? I don't have anyone in particular in mind to answer this, but I'm going to, Brenda, to you.
Oh, I'll take a swing at it. Great time to think. So I think fire is interesting in the sense that it's one of the few disaster categories that we feel like we have agency over. We don't try and herd hurricanes or tornadoes. We do a bit with flooding. So we have, there's a little bit. So I think there's this combination of fire is both the solution to the problem and the problem in its conversation. And it is one that we feel like we have a level of agency over. And so I think in terms of the force of mandated adaptation, it's a little squishier. So we, in forces that are just like, this is just going to keep clobbering you and there's nothing we can do about it, we tend to see a little bit of a different adaptation trajectory, I think in sort of policy and institutions. Things that we feel like, it's like, oh no, we could just stop that. Or we could, there's going to be a technological innovation that's going to just make this all go away like it did before. It slows adaptation down, I think, a bit. And so I think fire is interesting for that. I think it's both challenging because it can't be seen as just the bad guy, because it's also part of the good guy. Returning the ecological role of fire onto the landscape is important, and we need to be able to figure out how to work with that. And it also is something that we do have some ability to have agency over, and yet we can't get too cocky with that. So it's one that creates some fuzziness with it that I think is slowing down, I think, some of the adaptation that we might otherwise be seeing.
If you're going to give us a soapbox, I'd going to jump on it.
Here is your soapbox.
Yeah. I definitely think that the messaging in the media, the way we hear about fire, has a lot to do with how we react to it. And I think there's some real problems there. Often, when we have a big wildfire or a big home loss event, the message that we often hear is, oh, we need to go out and treat the forests, right? We need to have better fuel breaks, but thin the forests. And actually, after you look at these events, it's clear that embers from relatively far away, in many cases, blew in, and the homes were the fuel that carried the fire through these neighborhoods and caused all of these fatalities. And so there's actually kind of a difference between our wildland-urban interface, home loss and life loss set of problems, and our land management, wildland fire problems. They're sort of separate. They're connected, obviously, but the solutions are actually distinct and different. And in the WUI, it's where and how we're building. And I really am happy that the public health voices are starting to be heard, because that's kind of a missing piece of this. And I feel like if we have more of that awareness, more of those conversations, more of those voices, we're probably going to have some compromises in things like land use and urban planning that we wouldn't have had otherwise for the sake of public health. So I think the messaging is a big part of it.
Do you think people are maybe more willing to listen to compromise ideas now?
From a public health perspective,
Yeah.
I do. That's where you get people having heated arguments about vaccines and seatbelts and helmets. These are all infringements, with air quotes,
Mhm.
on our liberties. But so is guidance on where and how we build. But it feeds back to affect all of us in terms of health and taxpayer impacts. So I'm really happy that the public health voices are more in the conversation now.
Colleen or Kevin, any thoughts on either media representations of fire or the public health angle as well? Nope. Okay. We have one more question from the audience, and I think this will probably be our last one. I work on fire in the global south, and I wonder how all the great research you're going on in North America might contribute to fire risk management where the conditions are very different. Global south, of course, being quite a large area, but I think that question about what can we learn from North America for other regions is very true. No one's jumping in, so I'm going to start off with focusing on the wildfire-urban interface, the WUI. I think that's one that is certainly very applicable, probably in most places. Are there any lessons that you think can apply more broadly, Max?
I do. I think that the way we design our communities, and kind of where I ended my little intro with sort of a mangled slide, I apologize for that. I think that where and how we build our communities is kind of a universal issue, and I think probably how we deal with the impacts of fire, is somewhat general. I suspect projecting fire and managing fire is extremely context specific, but building survivable and more sustainable communities, I do believe that the lessons we're learning in one part of the world translate well to other parts of the world. So, from building codes at the scale of a structure to how we lay out a community so that it can be buffered, to having considering refuges of last resort within communities for people to retreat to for both, last resort, or for smoke and clean air purposes. All of these are design principles that we could share and benefit from, I think, universally.
Mm-hmm.
I'll go ahead and jump in, just sort of building on what Max is saying. I think there are examples in lots of places of resilient design, and I think we need to elevate those and understand them. And I think, when I think about it from an institutional perspective and sort of a societal, cultural perspective, different places just have different relationships to community. They have different relationships to land. They, and so much of what's happening in the United States is constrained by some very old, ideas and ideologies in our relationship to land and our relationship to land ownership and our things like that. And I think it's so, which is not just, I think there's lessons that can translate down. I also think there might be lessons that can translate up of, we may need to fundamentally rethink how we relate to some of these other systems. And there are examples out there around the planet of people doing it differently. So I think if nothing else, really sort of elevating some of those voices and experiences to just say, this is partly a function of how we do things here in the United States, and other places do it differently, and they're seeing different stuff. And so we might want to sort of just recognize that, and really sort of think about this from a global perspective and really elevating where we're seeing resilience and people that are, places that are very well adapted to being in, to contexts that do have a lot of these sort of natural disturbances that are happening. And at least as a point of like, why is that? Why is it that this works here and doesn't work this other place? If for another reason than to help us all sort of collectively understand why we do the things that we do.
Excellent. Thank you. And I know I said that was the last question, but I just saw another one pop into the chat. I think we've talked about compounding risk a little bit, but we haven't so much talked about inequality, which is the final question here. So Pauline Dubé asks, could we then say that fire is enhancing inequalities? And I think this was probably about the sort of climate gentrification question that we talked about a little bit earlier. But again, so the question is fire enhancing or sort of changing inequality?
Yeah, and so, the comment about climate gentrification came from work that's not my own, so I don't feel as an expert to talk about whether or not that is creating inequality in that regard. I can say it in terms of health inequalities. So within the smoke and health literature, we do find that there are, at least in my work, and I think in some other work too, we find that individuals who are sort of lower income or less educated are much more affected by wildfire smoke than people who are wealthier or higher income, despite the fact that we don't see differential exposures. And that's because we're modeling exposure, I think, incorrectly. We're modeling exposure as outdoor exposure. And we know that people spend about 90% of their time indoors, and our indoor environments are highly differential by class. And so we probably have more people who have outdoor jobs that are working strenuously outdoors in construction, in agriculture, are going to get much higher exposed, but that's not showing up in the way we do the studies, as well as what we're seeing in our work and others in terms of homes. There's a big difference in terms of how much air pollution gets into homes depending on how old the home is, how well it's been kept up, sort of how leaky it is. And also, as I said before, about the ability to sort of filter the air that comes through, whether that's through an air conditioning system or whether it's through portable air cleaners. All of these things have costs. And so we think those are highly patterned by ability to pay. And so the fact that we have where our society keeps getting more and more unequal in terms of economics. We have huge increases in income inequality in the United States. We're also likely impacting every hazard, not just fire, smoke, but a lot of others, and affecting health outcomes. So we have health disparities because that are very unequal because of wildfire smoke, but also lots of other things too.
I would just add the lots of other things does include water, and I think we've seen a lot of evidence in the West of those inequalities being exacerbated with provision of safe drinking water. The infrastructure that's in place in communities that are less advantaged is much more vulnerable. Development of the infrastructure to treat water it doesn't scale well economically. So in other words, we to put the type of robust treatment you would need to treat water that's degraded by fire into smaller communities or communities that are less advantaged, you just don't have the resource base there to support that. And so we see a lot of those communities struggling for many years to provide safe drinking water, and they may end up on, or they're more likely to end up on, boil water advisories and those persisting for longer periods of time after wildfire. So.
Thank you. So that was, as promised, our final question. I'll just give everyone a final opportunity to use the soapbox if you'd like. No takers? Well, then I would just like to say a huge thank you to all of our speakers. This has been a really interesting discussion, lots to think about. I've really enjoyed hosting the forum and working with all of you. Thanks again to Ninad and Camilla, who've been very helpful sending me questions here. And Thanks to Sarah and Lauren, who have also been working behind the scenes to make this happen. The recording will be available soon on the CellPress Sustainability Hub, and anyone who registered for the event will also get it sent via email, I believe. For our audience, first of all, thank you so much for being here. We would greatly appreciate it if you could take the survey, which I believe just showed up on your screens. Thanks again for watching today, and we hope to see you at the next Sustainability Forum. Thanks all.